that the UK or the nations that currently constitute the UK, but perhaps in their own separate independent avatars, it's quite likely indeed, in my view, that Scotland will become independent and perhaps should become independent and will rejoin the EU. So whether it's the UK or whether it's the constituent nations of what is currently the UK, I've no doubt whatever that they will be jointly or singly all back in the EU at some point in the not too distant future. But there are two possible futures. One is that we might have to wait for change in political sentiment, change in the outlook and attitude and constitution really of the population and its attitudes, the nature of the changing relationship with Europe. And that could be 20 years, or it could be less. But there is a way of expediting that. There is a way of getting back into the EU much, much more quickly than that. There is, in fact, even a way that one can imagine being back in the EU within 6 years. Now, that sounds improbable, and indeed it may not be the most likely eventuality, but it is not impossible. And one thing that I very much want to stress is that anything that is possible can be made actual if we are very determined and resolved to do it. And I want to suggest tonight some very practical things we could do that really might bring forward the date at which we rejoin the EU. I repeat, I think it is an inevitability that we will be back in the EU. Geopolitical and economic factors by themselves will ultimately force that. There is no way that a modest-sized island state like ourselves can do anything other than diminish. And we are already seeing before our horrified gaze how very quickly things are unraveling just 7, 8 months, 9 months since Brexit actually started on the 1st of January this calendar year. So let us see if there is a practical way that we can make our rejoining the EU happen sooner rather than later. That's what I want to talk about. And in talking about it, I need to remind you of a couple of things. This is not a matter of fighting old battles and revisiting the 2016 referendum, because this battle is still going on. What happened in 2016 and what has happened since is still part of the current situation. And some of the facts that have emerged, some of the facts relating to what has happened in the 2016 referendum and in the 2019 general election and in the period between the 2017-2019 elections are very relevant to our thinking now and to our planning now. So I want to remind you of two very, very important points that we should bear in mind. The first of them is that we came this close to stopping Brexit. In the later part of 2019, October, November, we were this close to stopping Brexit if only the opposition parties had not agreed to a general election. If they had not agreed to a general election, there would have been another referendum, we would have got it, and we would be in the EU today. I'm morally certain of those facts. But we made a bad mistake. The opposition parties made a very bad mistake in agreeing to a general election. It's a product actually of a very dysfunctional political culture that we have in this country. And one of the things that we've learned from the whole debacle from 2015, 2016 until now is that we really do have to think very seriously about our constitutional arrangements here. But let me say about that immediately, although I think there is one very important thing that we must do in the way of reform, and that is our electoral system. We must be very careful to proceed step by step in the matter of reform. We must not seek to reform our electoral system for the House of Commons and the House of Lords and the monarchy and have a codified constitution and everything else with a kitchen sink in it, because if we try to do that, we will do nothing. We must be extremely focused and have one aim and one aim alone, and that is to get electoral reform. And the reason why that is an important step towards rejoining the EU, I will explain in a moment. Because the other thing that I want to remind you of is some facts about the 2019 election, the one that brought Boris Johnson into power. In that election, the Conservative Party gained a massive 80-seat majority in the House of Commons on the basis of 43% of the votes cast in that election, representing about 29% of the total electorate. Now, under no imaginable circumstances of rationality can this be regarded as democratic legitimacy. Our system is so distorting, is so out of whack with the interests and needs of our country, delivering us into one-party rule, into a one-party state, no different in practical terms from, let us say, China or North Korea, from the point of view of how things stand at the moment. The House of Commons is a talking shop, a lot of hot air. There's some very good people in it. Indeed, there are good people on both sides, and mainly on the opposition benches, the different opposition parties. But opposition to a government with a whipped 80-seat majority is pretty well impotent. It's pointless. And therefore, the House of Commons is a zombie house. And it is the creature of the executive, of this cabinet that Boris Johnson has put together out of his most loyal and most pro-Brexit supporters. And we are this is the result of our first past the post electoral system, which is so distorting. And just as a little footnote remark, just so that it is quite clear in our minds why it is that the first past the post system is so undemocratic, think of this. Imagine that you have a constituency with 100 voters in it, and imagine that 10 people offer themselves for election. And suppose 8 of them get 10 votes each, one gets 9 votes, and the last of them gets 11 votes. Who goes to Parliament? The one with 11 votes. That's first past the post. 89 out of the 100 electors are unrepresented. Now, this typically happens in our electoral system. In the 2019 election, 57% of the people who voted didn't vote for the Conservative government, and yet we've got a Conservative government with a massive majority. So there is an urgent need to reform our electoral system, quite independently of any other consideration, quite independently of getting back into the EU. And here is an important point, by the way, that although I will argue in a moment that achieving electoral reform would get us back into the EU pretty quickly, that fact is not one that we should couple too intimately with the demand for electoral reform, because of course there will be people who are in favor of electoral reform, but who may not want to get back into the EU or may not have made up their minds about it yet. And so we do need to decouple the question of electoral reform, that is an essential first step, from the question of what a reformed parliament would do in the way of the EU, in the process of getting that electoral reform. Because getting that electoral reform means that we citizens, we voters, no matter what political party we belong to, have got to argue with politicians of all parties, but especially, of course, all the opposition parties, that they have to make common cause for the next election on a joint platform of electoral reform. Again, I'll come back to that point too, because there is a powerful case to be made for an electoral alliance on an electoral reform platform, because none of the opposition parties, including the Labour Party, has a hope in hell of forming a majority of the House of Commons unless they are in coalition with one another and they can change the way the House of Commons is constituted. But I'll come back to that point in a moment. So the first and most pressing things to bear in mind always are, first, that we came very close to stopping Brexit, that there isn't a genuine democratic majority in this country in favor of Brexit, and there never has been. In fact, in every actual poll, whether it's the referendum, whether it's the 2 general elections that we've had since then, in every actual poll, there has never been more than 37% of the total electorate of all those enfranchised in this country who are in support of leaving the EU. And when you look at opinion polling, consistently, more people think that it has been a bad mistake to leave the EU then think it was a good idea, a good thing to leave the EU. And that gap is growing as the realities of Brexit start coming home to roost. So we have a very great deal to play for here. We've got a lot on our side. And if we think that Brexit itself is the phenomenon that is the result of our very dysfunctional political order, and that it is now vital that we fight for and argue for electoral reform as a first step to getting back into Europe, we can put our energies in that direction. So now let me say something, a little something about the electoral reform matter itself. I'll just say straight out now, there are various arguments pro and con, and there are various systems which are put forward. I personally think that the single transferable vote system is probably the most effective and workable and practicable one, and it would be very successful as a means of getting a more representative parliament. One thing that you should notice is that the only representative body anywhere in the United Kingdom which is elected on this extremely distorting first past the post system is the House of Commons. The devolved authorities in the United Kingdom, and even indeed the select committees of the House of Commons themselves, have as their chairman elected on some form of proportional system. So it is not as though the MPs in the House of Commons don't know about these systems, or that our country or that our constitution is unwelcoming to them, because proportional systems of representation are more common in our country than this one first past the post system, which so distortingly elects the House of Commons. A couple of points that are usually urged against getting a PR system like single transferable vote is that you don't get quote unquote strong government. That is a government with an assured majority in the House of Commons. But I've already mentioned that if you have a whippable majority in the House of Commons, a majority over all the other parties jointly, then you in fact get one party state government, because the House of Commons becomes the creature of the executive. It does the executive's will. A legislature is meant to hold an executive to account, to challenge it, to scrutinize what it is doing. But if you, through the whipping system and through the career anxieties of MPs, if you've got control over the House of Commons, then you get your legislation through on the nod. The counterexample to it is the so-called hung parliament that existed between the Theresa May election of 2017 and the Boris Johnson election of 2019. In those 2 years, we saw the House of Commons being what it should be. Every single measure that the executive wanted to get through had to win its spurs on a case-by-case basis on the floor of the House of Commons. And there was debate and argument, and it was in the balance whether or not they would be able to get a number of votes to go through. And that is what the House of Commons should exactly be like. That is what a legislature should be like. It should have the power, the numbers, to control what the executive is doing. People will also say, they will point out to you that as I speak to you today, on the 8th of September, 2021, the government of the Netherlands has not been formed since the election that they had in the Netherlands back in March. A government has not been formed because all the different parties can't agree on a joint program. And everybody throws their hands up in disgust and they think this is absolutely terrible. I think it is marvelous. I think there should be time taken for all the different political parties to work out what they're going to do between them in the interests of everybody in the country, since the spread of interests and preferences, the needs, the desires of a population have expressed themselves in a number of different parties. And these parties have to sit down and agree that they're going to form a government which is not going to be a party political government, but which is going to be a government of agreement for the country as a whole, which respects the spread of interests that there are in the country. This is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of maturity. It's a sign of the fact that that system respects the idea, what would seem to be a revolutionary idea when you think of it in our circumstances, that government should transcend politics, that a government should not be one faction getting its way, pushing its agenda through because it cannot be opposed in the legislative house. We are witnessing at this very moment in our own country, before our horrified eyes, a conservative, a very far right-wing conservative government pushing through changes to electoral commission boundaries, well, they were due to happen anyway, but trying to restrict access to voting rights by, requiring ID. There's never been a problem with that in this country. By introducing a new version of the poll tax, the same tax for everybody unless you earn more than £50,000 a year, through the so-called national insurance levy, which is of course not hypothecated to the National Health Service, but is in fact a general tax. And all these things are being done on a very, very partisan basis, with no possibility of the opposition parties being able to deal with them properly. So the need to reform our system and to get a proportional system of representation is now more than beyond urgent, because we've seen how our system so far has let us down. It was more than 100 years ago, back in the 1860s, and John Stuart Mill wrote a book called Representative Government. And in it, he pointed out, he accepted, acknowledged the fact that the electoral system was not truly representative. He also pointed out that the very diffuse and uncertain and ambiguous nature of our constitutional arrangements, since we don't have a codified constitution, very different things, the limits of powers and so forth are of the organs of government. He said these things don't matter, they give us some flexibility, and in any case we can rely on the fact that members of parliament are gentlemen. Of course, in those days, they were all just men, and John Stuart Mill optimistically thought that they were all gentlemen, and therefore would behave themselves. Well, some of you may remember that when President Eisenhower was first elected back in the United States, he was opposed by a man called Adlai Stevenson, a very, very intellectual man, who is the source, by the way, of an amusing story, which is that somebody said to him, "Oh, Mr. Stevenson, all the thinking people in America will vote for you." And he said, "Well, I'm delighted to hear it, but I need a majority." And of course, this is the general problem with the world at large, that the thinking folks are never sufficiently in a majority. But also, when Eisenhower was elected, Adlai Stevenson said, the New Dealers, that's meaning the people who had come in with Roosevelt 20 years before, the New Dealers have been replaced by the car dealers. And this is something that was said about the changed nature of the Conservative Party in the Thatcher era, that the Conservative Party had been a party of patricians who regarded it as a sort of birthright, but also a responsibility to enter into government, the sort of people that John Stuart Mill thought were gentlemen. Well, the gentleman has, I'm afraid, long vanished from politics, and there certainly are very, very few of them on the Conservative benches, I would venture to say, in the House of Commons today. So we cannot rely on good faith, on benevolence, on a sense of service, because our politics has become too divided, too polarized, and too much the victim of slogans, three-word slogans: get Brexit done, blah, blah. And we now therefore have to try to repair the damage which has been done to our country by the fact that the political order of our country allowed Brexit to happen. And here again, we're not refighting battles. We are reminding ourselves of a very key point, which is that the 2016 referendum on EU membership was, as you may recall, an advisory-only referendum. If you read the House of Commons briefing paper 02712, published in early June of 2015, Section 6 and 7 set out the fact that it is only advisory, and that if there were any suggestion that it was not advisory, it would have to have a threshold or a supermajority, because the potential change to the country would be so dramatic. You may remember that in the 1979 Scottish devolution referendum, a majority of people voted in favour, but it didn't meet the minimum threshold requirement of 40%, and therefore it didn't happen. Well, in this country, it takes a minimum 40% threshold of the entire membership of the trades union for that trades union to be able to call a strike legitimately. It takes 66% of all sitting MPs in the House of Commons to agree to a dissolution and a general election outside the terms of the Parliamentary Act. And the reason why there are thresholds and supermajorities is to guard against doing something silly, doing something which would result in a massive change, which really is not legitimate in the eyes of the people. Well, the proportion of the franchise, and remember that it was a restricted franchise. Our fellow EU citizens living and working and paying taxes in this country, our own expats living abroad, been abroad for more than 15 years, our 16 and 17-year-olds who were given a vote in Scotland in 2014 because their futures were immediately impacted. All these people were excluded from the EU referendum. So it was a restricted franchise, and only 37% of that franchise voted to leave. And yet here we are in the middle of this awful situation. That is a symptom of the decay of the rotten floorboards of our constitutional political order, which has allowed this dreadful Brexit thing to happen, this epic mistake of Brexit. So it is now key, it is now that the time has come to do the key important thing, to start reclaiming our country and to rebuilding it and to shoring up its institutions and structures. And that key thing is electoral reform. Now I'm going to come back to the point about electoral reform and how we get it just in a moment. As I said earlier, we need to decouple it from the question of what happens afterwards in relation to the EU. But amongst us, among we pro-EU friends here, I can point out why electoral reform would be a very, very natural and quick step towards getting back into the EU as follows. If we were to get electoral reform, the House of Commons elected after the next election, so on the assumption that it is elected on a proportional basis, would be receptive to the demand from those of us, and we are very large in numbers, and we are very strenuous in our actions here. They would be receptive to a demand for another say on EU membership. A reformed House of Commons would be receptive to giving the country another say on EU membership. And if there were another say on EU membership, who among you would not be confident that we could win it? Not least because we wouldn't make the same mistake that we made in 2016, thinking that nobody is stupid enough to want to leave the EU, and then being too relaxed about it, and not arguing enough. We concentrate too much on just the economic considerations, but the economic considerations are incredibly important, of course. But we should also have talked about the fact that the EU, for all its problems and flaws, and it is a very flawed thing, it's a work in progress. It's got a lot of work to do to make itself better. It needs reforms in various respects. It's a work in progress. But it is an extraordinarily imaginative project, one which is about peace and about cooperation and about unity. When you set it against the background of centuries of internecine strife and war and bloodshed, and in particular the horrors of the First and Second World War, when you think about how imaginative, bold and brave it was of the architects of the iron and coal community, and then the EEC, and then the EU itself, to say enough, let us have a new model of the way that peoples in a continent can live together. This is a marvelous imaginative enterprise, and we should be part of it. We should be right at the heart of it. We should be working to help to build it. We should cease to be what we were, 1 foot in and 1 foot out, and being a bit of a drag anchor, and getting all these wonderful exceptions and things that we had. We should be part of that story, and we should be helping to make it work. And when our opportunity comes to have another say on EU membership, we should be putting that aspect of the argument as vigorously and as enthusiastically as we can. So the connection that I'm making here is between a reformed House of Commons being receptive to another say on Europe and to our winning that next referendum and getting ourselves back into Europe. And the reason why I said earlier that this could be six years' time is to think of the timescale. There's going to be another general election within the next 2 or 3 years here. If we can get all the opposition parties to join together on a platform of electoral reform, if they form a coalition government at the next election, if they introduce an electoral reform bill, and if on that basis they have another election, then in 4 years' time, we could have a reform parliament. And within a couple of years after that, we could have had our say again, being given our second say on European membership, now that we know the facts and we've seen the consequences, and we could be on our way back into Europe. That is why I think that we could even today consider, admittedly, it may not be all that likely, but it is not impossible. And things that are not impossible, with vigor, with enthusiasm, with passion, can be made to happen. So now the really, really key point that faces us all, those of us who want this to happen, is that we have to bend our energies to getting electoral reform. And to get electoral reform, we have to get the opposition parties to agree. Now, as it happens, all the opposition parties, with the exception of the Labour Party, have agreed to form an electoral alliance for the next election. The Labour Party, the biggest of the opposition parties, but with no prospect of getting an absolute majority in the House of Commons next time anyway. So if they were really realistic, they would see the benefit of joining with the other opposition groupings and being the lead party in a coalition. And maybe they will come to their senses. We have to see what's going to happen at the party conference this month, because many parties are putting forward motions to support electoral reform. And if the party adopts electoral reform as part of its program, then it has no reason whatever not to join on a common platform with the other parties. As I understand it, the Labour Party, in order to have a proper electoral alliance, which is what we really want and what we should be arguing for, would have to stand down candidates in some seats where the Greens, the Lib Dems, Renew, Plaid, and so on, have a better chance than they of winning that seat. And this may involve the Labour Party in suspending that part of its constitution which requires of it that it field a candidate in every constituency. Now, I'm not 100% certain that that is in fact a constitutional requirement in the Labour Party, but if it is, it would have to have the boldness and the maturity to do it. It will also have to have the boldness and the maturity to set aside its own dreadful internecine internal quarrels, because the internal divisions in the Labour Party are so horribly bitter, and there's such a huge gulf between the far left and the moderates in the Labour Party that I've twice been a member of the Labour Party and twice have fled from it in appalled horror, because I'm sorry, but those of you who are members of the party will know that sensitive souls like myself simply can't take constituency meetings, I'm afraid. So, but if the Labour Party is really interested in serving the country, if the Labour Party is really interested in bringing forward policies in our country that will be of benefit to working people, to the community as a whole, to protecting our National Health Service, to working in the interests of everybody in the country, they've got to grow up and they've got to see that how important it is that they must work with the other parties to throw the Tories out and to get electoral reform. This is really, really vital. It's an existential matter. And this is where I come to the point about us. No matter what party we belong to or whether we don't belong to a party, we citizens. You see, at the moment, we are held hostage, not just by the current Conservative government, but by the political process in our country. The political parties have their conferences and they vote and the leaderships put forward a program, and then the political parties offer us what they want in the way of policies. So we, the people, supinely sit and wait to hear what the parties are going to say and what they're going to offer us and what we should vote for. I think the time for that is over. The time for that would certainly be over if we had proportional representation, because in the situation of proportional representation, political parties who really have to listen to the country, to the people, have to be very, very alert to the genuine needs and to the diversity of those needs. You have to remember There is never such a thing as a majority in a country. There are only temporary coalitions of minorities which constitute a majority for some particular issue. A country, a nation, a people is a lot of different minorities and individuals. So there are a lot of different needs. And a government should be, when you think of Abraham Lincoln, government of the people, for the people. I mean, here's an interesting point. When Abraham Lincoln gave that wonderful speech at Gettysburg, it was in November 1863 at the cemetery where the terrible slaughter of the Battle of Gettysburg was being commemorated. And he there gave this definition: government of the people, by the people, for the people. And when you dig into that, government by the people, well, who were the people? They were white men who owned property. They were the only ones out of the vote. So they were the people in that first occurrence of the word people. Government of the people, that's everybody. So that's everybody in the country. So you've got to think, are we serious about being a party of government? Because government means for everybody. Government of the people, for the people. And that's what the Labour Party has to wake up to and say, instead of loving being in opposition so we can squabble with one another over, fine points of ideology, are we a really serious grown-up political party? Do we see the country's in trouble? What does it need? One of the essential things that it needs is to get its electoral system right so that we don't hand ourselves in permanent ownership of a conservative party which acts on behalf, quite boldly and quite nakedly, on behalf of the interests of those who support it, its donors and its voters. I mean, just look at the 1.5% increase in national insurance. We know that national insurance is not, as I say, a hypothecated tax. It's a general tax. It's a poll tax. It's paid no matter what you earn, unless you earn over 50,000 years, by everybody at the same rate. And yet it's paid at a lesser rate by people who are better off. This is the government, a government of a party, of a faction, which is serving the interests of only some people in the community. And grown-up politics has got to realize that government is for everybody. So we citizens have now got to grab by the lapel the politicians, the people who want to stand for election. It doesn't matter what party they're in. And we've got to say to them, this has absolutely got to stop. The position that we're in at the moment is the result of a political order, a constitutional set of arrangements, a voting system for the House of Commons, which has delivered us into an absolute dead end with Brexit. It's gone wrong. And it has gone very badly wrong because it has polarized the country, and one pole of the country, the 29% of the electorate who voted for the Tories, are really now in charge of everything. They are the North Korean government in office here in our own country. So we citizens have got to do this. We've got to do it individually when we meet politicians, when we write to them, not just to MPs, but to candidates, to local parties. But we can also do this through citizens groups. Now, one of the sponsors of this meeting is the Alliance for Europe, which is a trans-European organization. And if you go on the Alliance for Europe, by the way, I declare an interest here. I'm a board member. I'm on the board of the Alliance for Europe. And I think it's a very remarkable and wonderful body with a lot of resources that it can offer to us as citizens. Because one of the things that it does is it gives advice about forming citizens groups, gives information about potential funding for citizens groups, but you don't have to have a formal citizens assembly in Kent or in Dorset or wherever. You can have an informal citizens grouping, rather like this one, but one where you invite yet more and more people, and you go out and you recruit people into a citizens assembly, through which, and it's non-partisan, it's about getting our politics to be really responsive and responsible to us. So the case I'm putting to you is that we are at this really significant moment now. You might say, well, we had a referendum back in 2011 about proportional representation and it got absolutely nowhere. Well, let me just remind you of a couple of things there. Firstly, the alternative vote system that was being offered back in 2011 is not really PR at all. Secondly, it was not supported. On the contrary, it was despised by the majority party in the then coalition, who therefore did everything they could possibly do to undermine it. No information, no real discussion about it, put on the same day as local elections with very low turnouts. And the Conservatives thought that that would bury it for a generation, because it used to be thought that a referendum settled a matter for a generation. That's what some people will be hoping about the 2016 EU referendum. And that's something that we've got to change people's minds on, because we want another say. We want to be able to say, in 2016, there was no plan, no roadmap, no facts, no numbers, nothing what was said about what would happen if there was a leave vote. There was no program for it. Now we're seeing the realities. Now we know the facts. Now we know what Brexit means. Brexit doesn't mean Brexit, it means disaster. And we therefore want another say. But the only way we're going to get that say is to get through this barrier of the reform barrier, which is why we as citizens have now to be as vigorous and enthusiastic as we can be, because the moment has arrived to make this change, because this is the first of the changes that we can make thereafter. So that's the case that I want to make. Just a quick reprise. Let us work very hard for electoral reform. That means getting all the opposition parties to work together. Principally, it means persuading the Labour Party to get real and to get working with the other parties. It means getting a non-Tory coalition government into office in 2 or 3 years' time at the next general election, a reform bill, another election, and we campaign for another say on Europe. We get that say and we get our way back into Europe. That's the program, a very practical program, and one which, however unlikely it might seem to you at the moment, does have the possibility, and possibilities can be made real, realities, of getting us back into the EU sooner rather than later. We will be back one day, sooner rather than, sooner or later. We'll be back, in less than 20 years, 25 years, we will. But I don't want to wait that long. I don't want my children to be bereft of the opportunities that being part of the EU offers. I want us to get back in very soon. Let's see if we can do it. Peter, that's my harangue for the evening.
Thank you so much. We don't have applause on such things, so I'm just going to go like that for everyone, but everyone else is applauding. Thank you so much, Anthony. I'm going to model the process and use a bit of privilege, because I organised the event with the other people with Alliance of Europe and so on, and ask the first question, because I've been watching the questions. We have questions about the EU's reaction. We have questions about the cross-party PR creation and other things, which I shall come to. But my question is, you stunned me at the beginning, taking back control of the executive. And at Reboot Britain, we try and do 3 things reasonably well: breaking parliamentary paralysis, which is what I think you mean by taking back control of the executive. But what you haven't mentioned, we try and punch above our weight in the media to take back control of the media. And how do you see the media reaction? Do we have to do anything with the media?
Right, that's an excellent question. And by the way, this is why these question sessions are so important, because of course, one can't pack everything into a presentation. The media issue is a very, very seriously important issue. We've got, on the whole, a pretty dreadful right-wing media here. If you think about the Telegraph, the Times, the Express, the Mail, the Sun, we've got a headwind here. And alas, since the 24th of June 2016, BBC News has turned itself into a real problem. They've become the Brexit broadcasting company instead of the BBC. Now, for decades, I've been what the BBC very kindly call talent on the BBC. I used to be a presenter on the World Service and so on, huge admirer of the BBC and its output, except for its news coverage of these last few years, because they have been appalling. And I mean, really, the way they have misrepresented the problems with Brexit, all the phrases they use now, supply problems, which is now their latest euphemism for Brexit debacle and so on. So yes, you're dead right, we do have a problem with media. We have to tackle it. Now, I get quoted very frequently in the Express as a frantic, raving Remainer rejoiner. It always tremendously amuses me because I think, and I don't know whether I should be saying this in public in a way, but I think that some benighted soul in the Express newspaper agrees with me and is smuggling my message out to the Express readers by packaging it as the ravings of this loony rejoiner, because he quotes me accurately and he puts my case exactly as I would put it to his readers if I had an opportunity. And he even mentioned some of those on Twitter and so on who support me. So I think that the Express is, the Express is trying to smuggle out to their readership, some of the arguments and considerations which really matter. But we cannot rely on there being one or two individuals in the right-wing press who are trying to undermine what the right-wing press are doing. We've got to push back. We've got a dreadful, distorting media here who are as, they're as big and as constant a bunch of liars as Boris Johnson himself, and that is really saying something. So we have a problem. We do have a problem with our media, and we've got to think about how we deal with that. Support Byline Times, support every outlet there is, like the New European newspaper, support every outlet there is which tries to analyze and give the facts and puts the contrary story.
Thank you. I'm going to bring Rachel in a moment, but on one, she'd actually wish you would go on question time more often. You're obviously too important for question time, Anthony. But
I refuse to go on it because there is something about the way the BBC does these things. So for example, there's climate change, okay? So, the science and the evidence before our eyes tells us that we are ruining our planet. I'm a big fan of Greta Thunberg. I love the way she says her name. Greta Thunberg, she's terrific. And I'm a big fan of Extinction Rebellion because our planet is suffering and we're in danger. But the BBC will have somebody who points this out and somebody who says, oh, no, it's just, just raining today.
I'm going to bring Rachel on to a different point, actually, because she also talked about the non-democratic argument. Rachel, do you want to lead us through that?
Oh, which particular one? I've been chatting away there in the chat box.
Violence, Rachel.
Ah, the violence thing, yeah. Not that I'm inciting violence at all, but I remember what happened after the poll tax, and it did end up with violence on the streets. Do you think that is a likelihood? I have a very, very broad range of contacts in my life, and I'm already seeing people from the so-called Red Wall complaining about not being able to have blood tests, etc., etc. There's lots of different strands to this. They know that it's Brexit. They know that it is. That they're not that stupid. Will it have to become violent? They also know that the media is lying to them. They don't trust anybody anymore. And to my mind, we're heading towards something very, very dangerous indeed. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, look, I worry about this because I would very, very much, of course, rather see non-violent change. I'd rather see us do things in a way which is constitutional and which tries to bring everybody along on the basis of good reason and common sense. But I agree with you that I do think a tipping point could be reached. I mean, it does surprise me how, on the whole, calm things have been. I put it down to COVID, about the fact that people can't gather in large enough numbers. And if there weren't COVID, I think the situation would be slightly different. Now, a few years ago, there was a strike by lorry drivers. So there were no deliveries of fuel to petrol stations. And as a result, there was the real risk that supermarkets would become completely empty of goods within a few days. And I wrote an article at that time saying, think of how fragile the thin skin of civilization is. Because if all the supermarket shelves all went empty, within a very few days after that, there would be bands of people in the streets, breaking into people's houses, looking to see if there are any tins of baked beans in their larders, because people would be hungry, angry, and frightened. and it would not take much for that to happen. Something could be a trigger, as happened with the poll tax. It snapped with the poll tax, and people rampaged through the streets, and they smashed car windows and shop windows and what have you, out of sheer frustration and anger at the way they were being treated. And you cannot help but be worried that this might happen with this, because at some point it's going to get onto a hair trigger, and then what you fear could happen. I sincerely hope not. And by the way, this is another reason why I think the Labour Party, along with all the opposition parties, should be giving us real hope of substantial reform, which will get our situation back on track, so that people will again believe that they're being listened to. Because if they think, my God, we're going to be stuck, here are the Tories making it more difficult to get them out of Parliament, they're going to be in government forever, just dishing out our tax money to their friends and cronies and God knows what else, then the prospect of a violent revolution becomes even more real.
I'm going to bring Leah in, and probably Patrina, because they've asked a similar question. I've not forgotten Brendan Donnelly or Martin, but Patrina and Leah were talking about the EU's reaction to us. And I had said some while ago that they'd have to be sure that there wasn't a ping pong in out, shake it all about moment, that the culture carriers would have to be released to Ascension Island or something, Anthony. How do you see how the EU reacts to our wish to rejoin, I think? But perhaps could Leah just ask the specific question she had rather than me interpreting?
Hi, good evening, Professor Grayling. Thank you for this evening, and thank you for all your retweets as well. I'm Pearl Noir on Twitter. I was wondering what makes us think that the EU would actually want us back? And
for Patrina, do you have a different take on that question? Because they're all in the same ballpark. So I brought both of you in for this. If Patrina's there. If she's not, go on, because we're running out of time. Go on.
Okay. Well, look, the EU would like to have the UK in the EU. There's no question about it. There certainly are some people in EU Parliament and Commission who are not too unhappy about having us out for just a little while, so they can get on with some things without having us being a nuisance as we were in the past. So that's true enough. Also, of course, the EU is constantly evolving and changing. We've now got this wonderful conference on the future of Europe, which is kicking off, and which Alliance for Europe is taking a part in, which, by the way, all of us should be taking part in, because the EU wants to hear not just from people in EU member states, but from everybody. So the EU is going to evolve. And if we're out of the EU for too long, for 20 years, let's say, the EU is going to be very different. We're going to be very different. The conditions on which we get back in will be very different from now. You know, there's going to be no question not being part of Schengen and the Eurozone and all the exceptions that we had. So, but one reason why it's important that we get back in sooner rather than later is that we don't diverge too far from the EU. You can see that already this government is already derogating on things like environmental quality controls and food standards and so on, which is not good for us, for our health, but not good also from the point of view of getting back into the EU, where we need to reapply those standards. So that's very important. But the EU, of course, wants us back in because even though we are slipping down, you know, all the tables at the moment, we're still a big economy. And being part of the EU makes a difference. And there are many of the smaller countries in the EU which hugely appreciated the British role in the EU, because despite all the rhetoric and the politics and things that were said by politicians, diplomatically and from the point of view of the civil service and from the point of view of many of the things that have been done in the EU, like, for example, the single market itself, these were done with an enormous amount of very, very good British input, much appreciated by our European partners. And you will see, if you talk to members of the European Parliament or people in the Commission, and I do from time to time, you will see that they are eager to see us back in. And there, Peter, your point about will they think we're going to ping pong in and out and so on, that the answer is they feel that the one silver lining of Brexit is that when we do rejoin, it will be much, much more wholeheartedly. and also very probably on the basis of rearrangements to our own constitution here in the country, which will make us better partners, because it is our dysfunctional politics in the moment that makes us bad partners.
Thank you. Brendan, you had a question earlier. Do you still have a question? Yeah. If you are, can you unmute? Brendan Donnelly. If not, we'll go straight to Martin. Martin, you were itching to get a question in. Please be brief if you can, because we are short of time. Martin.
Right, I'm unmuting myself. Professor Grayling, I fear that I don't know how you propose to change Keir Starmer and Lisa Nandy's minds, but from my reading of it, the Labour Party is a pretty much pro-Brexit party. I don't think that we can rely on them at all. Any alliance with Labour is going to be an alliance for Brexit. There hasn't been a single ambiguous statement from Keir Starmer since he conned Remainers such as me into voting for him to be Labour Party leader.
No statement, Martin, just the question.
Okay, is that it? Yeah, so how do you, I'll leave it as a question, how do you propose to change their minds without electoral threat?
You make a very, very good point. The Labour Party leadership, Starmer, Nandy, you're dead right. Indeed, one or two of the Labour Party leadership have made definite pro-Brexit noises. We even see Ed saying we must embrace Brexit and so on. But as you know, Martin, the vast majority of Labour Party members, and certainly an even larger proportion of Labour Party voters, are pro-European, pro-EU, and they want to get back in. And the Labour Party knows that, the Labour Party leadership knows that. They also know they're treading on pretty thin ice at the moment with this strategy of saying, look, we're keeping our powder dry. We're not saying anything about Brexit. Think about the Red War. We will, at the right time, we will say something. What they're hoping to be able to do is they're hoping to say, we must renegotiate our relationship with the EU and be a bit closer to the EU. And that might be coding for, well, we're trying to get back in the single market. And then they might want to have some kind of step-by-step thing where we have some closer relation with the single market, if there were a Labour government and so on. But we know, and the Labour Party themselves know, they are not going to be in the majority in the House of Commons. They're therefore, at best and most, going to be the senior party in a coalition. Their coalition partners are going to be Lib Dems and Greens. And the Lib Dems, fortunately, have now come back out in the open as a pro-EU party. The Greens are a pro-EU party, and the Lib Dems and the Greens in coalition are going to say enough of all this ambiguity and pussyfooting and let us renegotiate a closer relationship. Let us find out what the people really want now about Brexit, because that certainly is what we, those of us on this call and those of us we know, should be fighting for as soon as the opportunity presents itself. So I wouldn't be so pessimistic about changing the Labour Party's minds. Realities, a nice cold douche of reality would be very salutary if we stop just sitting back and waiting for the Labour Party leadership to tell us what policies they will be pleased to offer us.
Okay, I have a question from Van Norris, who asked me to put it to him because his connection is poor. There's a few of the questions like this, actually, that it was the mechanism, something to do with the mechanism of cross-party arrangements, that given that politicians in a binary system tend not to hand out power to each other, how do you see the mechanism for that power sharing to happen? And then we've got Jane Maurice from Northern Ireland to follow.
Well, I mean, what the actual mechanics are of some kind of arrangement, whether there's a formal alliance, which is unlikely, or whether there is an agreement. I mean, all that we need to get is for all the opposition parties, including Labour, for at least one election, that's the next election, to say, let us work together to get electoral reform. And by working together, that means let us support one another in seats where we have a really legitimate chance of beating the Conservative candidate. And by the way, that's not that many seats. So they could make this arrangement, and they could have a joint program, share a commitment to at least reforming the electoral system for the House of Commons. And on that basis, not impossible, if they will be prepared to be mature and sensible about this, because this is the change that we so desperately need.
Okay, thank you. And we've got time for one more question before we release you, Anthony, for another cup of tea. It comes from Northern Ireland, from Jane.
Won't be a cup of tea this time, I can tell you.
Jane, do you want to unmute yourself? Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating, and I really admire your drive as well as your intellectual prowess. I'm from Northern Ireland. I used to be in politics here in the Women's Coalition, and I have proposed the extension of the Northern Ireland Protocol to Scotland, because I truly believe that Scotland holds the key to the whole House of Cards. And I believe that if the protocol was extended to Scotland, it would get rid of the controversy of the Irish Sea border for us. It would also give Scotland a way into the waiting room for the European Union. And it could also give Boris Johnson the olive leaf that tries to get Scotland to stay in the UK. So it ticks every box, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that idea.
Well, Jane, I think that is an extremely astute idea. It's a very clever idea. The only thing wrong with it is that I don't want any olive branches to Boris Johnson, but that's just me being me. but you're dead right, it would certainly solve a number of problems. However, unfortunately, rational, practical solutions are not the order of the day at the moment, are they? And I think something a little more a yes vote in a Scottish independence referendum, which Nicola Sturgeon is now committed to at some point in the next 24 months, will be the catalyst. I mean, so you're dead right that Scotland is the key card in the House of Cards, and what happens there really is going to change things. One of the things that will ensure those of us in England can get back our EU passports is if Scotland does go independent and does rejoin the EU, it's impossible that England will stay out. And it will pull the rug underneath, from underneath the English carpet here. So I used to be, I mean, look, I'm half English, quarter Scot, quarter Welsh. Now, it's complicated when the Six Nations rugby are on about who I'm supporting, but I managed it just about. But I've always been passionate about, keeping Scotland and England and Wales and Ireland all together. We're all kin, we're all the same folk, we're all family. I'm now a passionate supporter of Scottish independence, both for the Scots themselves, because I'm appalled to think how they have been dragged hither and thither by a Brexit wanting England to the detriment of Scotland. And so I'm now, fully in favour of their independence. And if they were to get it, even if indeed a referendum were in prospect, it would really shake things up here. So Jane, I think you're dead right. They are a key card.
Thank you. So what have we got? We don't work in headlines, but taking back control of the exec, taking back control of the media, taking back control of the constitution, the English carpet, which is a new one I've just learned. I think we ought to be exploring that. And if you only have a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. I think what you crucially illustrate, Anthony, is that we can't just rely on single strategies. We have to have a palette of different strategies. Otherwise, everything does look like a nail. Please join with the Alliance for Europe. We'll be sending some stuff out from this, obviously. For those that are staying on, don't go away. Anthony has to have, I think, a shandy now, don't you, Anthony?
Might be something in those lines, yes.
Something along those lines. But I just want to absolutely thank you for this hour. It's flown. And anything from you, otherwise we shall bid you farewell.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Very, very nice to be with you tonight. Thank you, Peter. Bye now.
Right, do stay around if you can, because this is like when there's a football match. There was so many comments on here that there wasn't time to get them all in. I'm not going to apologise. Just 20 minutes is like that. It flew. So we now are a bit more relaxed. We can use the facility of just butting in, or if you want, stick your hand up if you know how to do that. I know that not all of you use these tools. So people like Adrian, just butt in if you feel you want to. Just unmute and ask a question, but we'll try not to talk over each other. And there is tons of stuff in this chat box that has not been exhausted. It was just flying down. I couldn't see it all. So who begins? Now nobody's going to be forthright.
Go on, then I will,
Go on.
Peter. The usual suspects, Big Gobs, me and Mike. Sorry, Mike.
Yep.
I mean, what's really struck me recently is the degree to which everybody that ends up in Westminster in one way, shape or form, whether it's campaign groups or Parliament or think tanks, they all seem to lose touch with reality. How does that happen, and how do we stop it? Like the Labour Party just don't seem to know what's actually really happening on the ground.
I'm not going to continue the any questions thing. We get answers from other people. So who's got the answer to that?
Yeah, Richard.
I totally agree with you, Rachel. And without naming them, I just want to put some perspective on that from someone I personally know, who, when they went into Parliament, was so moral, so upstanding, always did the right thing, and has slowly been, well, for the greater good, if I side with the leadership on this, I know a little bit further down the line, this will happen. And it's heartbreaking to see decent people go down that route. But that's one thing I do agree with Mr. Grayling on. This is the way our system works, people, and this is how. And to be honest, the only way I think we can do it is being honest with our friends, as we would be with our enemies, as to where they're falling down, and call them out on it. That's just the point I would like to say on that.
Yeah, fair enough.
By the way, Rachel, Richard, in case it's not obvious and to all, Richard Hewison was the leader of the Rejoin Party.
Oh, pleased to meet you, Richard.
Who got 100,000 people to walk out onto the streets of London and vote for him. But it didn't go quite that well in Cheshire and Amersham, but we helped the Lib Dems win, didn't we, Richard? So
yeah, absolutely.
They were insanely jealous of the fact we were able to say Brexit and get away with it.
But again, this goes back to the point Rachel was making. I think you'll agree with me, Peter. So many of the Liberal Democrats we spoke to in Cheshire and Amersham were saying one thing to the people voting for them, but saying to us, look, really, we deep down, we do believe this. You know, it's just the...
I've got to say, I'm under huge and enormous and increasing pressure to stand for my local authority as a Liberal Democrat. And I can't, because I'm not prepared to toe anybody else's line. I'm not prepared to change my Facebook feed, and I'm not prepared to be whipped. I'm just not. I can't do it. I'm happy to stay a member of the party, but if standing for council means that I have to toe any kind of disingenuous line, I can't do it.
In my case, I do the whipping, but that's for another day. Now over to Mike, who'd got a question, because he was next, as far as I could tell. Mike, or a comment?
Yeah. Well, partly a question. So I do explore a little bit the question of what happens until the next election. So, you know, completely agree with everything Anthony said. That's a sensible path. But there's such a thing as preparing the ground. Now, my own belief, which is a separate point, is that Boris Johnson will get thrown out by the Tories in probably the next year. The Tories usually change or more often than not, change their leaders between elections. But my question was about, is it worth pushing for a sort of strong cross-party parliamentary inquiry into the impact of changed trading relationships, the problems we have, the ways that they could be resolved, not because that on its own is going to change things in 2 years, but it prepares the ground.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone got comments on that? Before I mean, I will start this. I believe that preparation is everything. I haven't stopped, as you know, when we've been told that there's nothing we can do. And my point is, it's a one-way trip. Once we airbrush Brexit out of the lexicon, it's gone. but I believe we can do that. Preparation is the mother of inspiration. I think that's a phrase I just made up. What do others think about that? We're just going to take that as a point then, Mike. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Helga's next. Do you want to say something, Helga?
Yeah, absolutely fascinating presentation and discussion so far. In answer to the question, why do people with sort of noble aims and sort of morally upright people sort of get into Parliament and then basically end up a load of rubbish? Well, W.S. Gilbert said it in 1882, so it's been going on for a long time. Opening of Act 2 of Iolanthe, well, fairly the opening. Private Willis says, or sings, when in that house MPs divide, if they've a brain and cerebellum too, they've got to leave that brain outside and vote just as their leaders tell them to.
And this is a book that I keep very close by me. The title you might be able to see is "The Situation is Hopeless but Not Serious." I think that adequately sums the problem. Okay, Martin, and then I want to get.
I wanted to ask Rachel something. Well, I can do it now, but I couldn't find her. I didn't. Are you saying that the Lib Dem leadership would prevent you messaging in favour of rejoining the EU if you stood as a candidate?
Well, I don't think I have that much
or
power.
would censor your Facebook or whatever else feed?
No, I think that I don't think that they would say thou shalt not, but they do it in that British passive-aggressive way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
How general is that within the Lib Dem? I mean, are the Lib Dem membership going along with this?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, it's weird. I actually have more to do with the Liberal Democrats where I used to live than I do now, even though I'm a member. And I know in that circumstance, you know, they are absolutely pro-European and as bloody angry as they were in 2016, if not more so, in fact.
I think they are, yeah.
I mean, we have Kate here from the Green Party, who will have a more freedom of outlook on this, but even they at the moment are trying to keep a little bit quiet on Brexit in certain areas. I know that John Johnson said on here we can't talk about Brexit. It rather depends where you're talking, I think. In London, it's probably much easier than it is in sort of North Yorkshire. But
John Green Party, for Pete.
Sorry?
Is John Johnson Green Party?
I don't know. We'll ask him in a moment. But have you any thoughts from the point of view of the Greens at all, Kate, about that? Because, you know, everyone knows that the word Brexit is toxic. That I do understand and, you know, to some degree respect. My problem is it goes away then. But any thoughts at all?
I think the whole system is toxic at the moment, personally. Everything, no matter what discussion you're having, it has a toxic nature to it. I think what Anthony was saying with regards to proportional representation is key. It's because it's not just Brexit that's a disaster, it's everything that's, you know, the trade deal that's been done with Australia and the environmental impact that's going to have. It's all absolutely just toxic. So in terms of as a party, yeah, we are a pro-European party. There are members that voted against, voted to leave Brexit, to leave Europe. And there are members that still feel that way. And there are members who have changed their opinions, like myself. And it's trying to negotiate a way through with the general population. I think that from the outside, what the Lib Dems did with the 2019 and Vote for Us and We Will Stop Brexit, I think that came across very poorly to the general population and had quite a big impact on their, I know we had the Amersham vote, but like locally, the Lib Dems did very poorly in 2 local by-elections, very, very badly.
I think the 2019 Lib Dem experience had a lot to do with hubris of one particular leader and creating an unbelievable dream and a lot followed from that. But I spend a lot of time on the street, as you know, and quite a lot of people here spend a lot of time on the street. If you ask people about Brexit, they will talk to you about it. The politicians believe it's unsayable, but and I should point out to others here, so that you get to know each other. Kate sort of spearheaded the Greens, did a superb performance here in Strood with her gang of volunteers, and nearly knocked the Tories out, really. But that it was almost, yeah. So it was something that we sort of discussed a bit. How that played out, in my view, is that Labour played the very, very traditional binary game of going to the dispossessed and saying bugger the Tories, and that seemed to probably get them over the line. But anyway, we could debate that endlessly. So I wanted to get John Johnson in, because he talked a little bit about civil unrest and other things, and more radical approaches, which, strategic planners, politicians don't like to talk about, this uncomfortable truth of people fighting over chicken in Tesco's, which Rachel and I discuss from time to time. But do you want to get in, John? Unless he's buggered off to go and fight someone, perhaps. He's already gone onto the streets. We've lost him. Right, someone else then. Robert, you were trying to unmute a while ago. Have you got anything to chuck in?
Yeah, Peter, I was quite interested in those comments about the electoral reform and Scottish independence. It's a bit of an eye-opener, actually, to me, the importance of that electoral reform, and I shall certainly be digging around and trying to. I certainly will support that. Try and get involved.
Thank you. I'm going to do a quick. This is not like a commercial break, but you can now go to the toilet or get a glass of wine. I haven't said anything about what's coming up, so I meant to do that at the end, but I didn't want to spoil Anthony's thing, and I didn't want to waste time by doing that. But if anyone's in London on Saturday, we're doing the Albert Hall. We're not playing at it. We're going to stand outside and make a racket with a mini and some classical musicians and some rock musicians and some hangers-on. I'll be in the hangers-on car. So that's Saturday. Apart from
the last night of the proms.
Yeah, the last night of the proms. Apart from that, we are also planning a trip around the whole entire UK, if we can manage it with the car, taking a message that we're still here and this people haven't forgotten. We're everywhere, literally. So we're going to do Land's End to John O'Groats. And the final thing we are working on, which I'm not going to do one of our regular meetings. We have regular meetings every Monday, whereby we talk about things, we produce things, we do some work on parliamentary paralysis, we do some work on getting into the media, we do some work about sort of, talking people over one-to-one. Our 3 goals are those, basically. Oh, we've got a load of people rejoining the meeting, so right. So the other thing we have been doing, and I'm not going to let this dwell up on the screen for very long, but we did this, some of the people that are here have worked on some 10-year scenarios, which are not completely inconsistent with what Anthony said. I was really pleased to hear that. They are, of course, different because we have so many methods and recipes of what we think should happen. So there are some differences here, but these are sort of macro scenarios: political, economic, social, and ethical, environmental, technological, and so on, and legal. So you'll see that we've sort of put in here, and Martin was responsible for this, that Labour starts to break apart. It is one of the scenarios that's put forward, and it possibly leads to the formation of a, some cross-party thing. But then there's Scottish independence being discussed in 2023. The House of Cards point that Jane put forward, that Ireland starts to move in some direction, be it with Scotland, be it on its own, whatever, around 2025. Then there's obviously Welsh independence follows that. London thinks it doesn't want people bleeding all the money out the capital, so London PLC becomes possible, and so on and so forth.
Londependence.
Yeah, the thing that is in red the things that are in red are, we've already decided are not feasible. This is unfinished work. So, and we're writing narratives at the moment. So Prince Charles is unlikely to sell the crown jewels on eBay. And we don't think that Trump will colonize Mars, but we rather hope he might. King Arthur will save us and all of that. But we were working through this, and we will be populating this and the narratives that go with it from Anthony's talk. So just to say,
I have noticed you've got mainstream media turns on Johnson. I think that will happen sooner rather than later.
We sometimes get into debates about where.
I had a raised eyebrow getting into the shower this very morning, listening to that bloke. I can't remember his name. The bloke on LBC, challenging, asking where the 350
Ferrari
pounds. Yes, thank you, Nick Ferrari, asking where the 350 million a week was, which and I was like, oh, and about time too.
Yeah. You will notice that the right-wing media are starting to oppose Brexit now, and are starting to ask questions about it, and that's because they like to back winners, and they've started to realise that Brexit is a loser. So now they're starting to ask hard questions, and I think the Tories and Boris Johnson will eventually be the losers from that.
Yeah.
But there you go. Yeah.
Which may explain why Johnson is trying to move on things like social care to date and to do a nod to some people.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. So yeah, this is work in progress. All I would say is, if you want to, this is not all we do on a Monday, but I would encourage you, if you enjoy this evening, then do come back for one of our regular meetings on a Monday. So let's move on to what we were talking about. So Gove has been mentioned. So Rishi, people are talking about who gets to pass file for Johnson. Who else wants to reflect on Anthony's session? So that's the ads done now. You can come back from the toilets and all of that. Just unmute yourself if you want to say something.
I think from a political point of view, we saw with the Strood North and the Prince's Park by-elections in Medway, stated that about 9% of the total electorate in Strood North actually elected their councillor. So it's all very well us fighting for electoral reform, but how do we get people to vote? How can we get people to see that they have got a power to make decisions?
They haven't.
But how can we say that they can have that power if they fight for PR, for example? How do we do that?
Somebody put something in here earlier. It flew past me about making votes matter. I don't know whether that's the answer, but the Tories, particularly the Tories, have succeeded in telling people you don't need to think about this stuff because we lie anyway. So why would anyone worry about it? And of course, a lot of what we experience on the doorstep, Kate, is people saying, "I don't give a flying blah."
Or people say, what's the point? They're all the same. And they've got a point. They are all the same, because as Richard kind of confirmed, once people, I know from my own dabblings in politics over the decades that in order to play the political game, you do have to compromise your own heart, and I hate it. I hate politics. It's horrible. It's just nasty, and I really understand why your average Joe says it's got nothing to do with me and they're all the same anyway, because they are, and it hasn't got anything to do with them.
But saying they're all the same is, and I can see all the temptations for that, it is what the most deceitful want you to believe.
I know, yeah.
Because
but it's also the same as in red or blue. So if you only vote red or blue and you get a red or a blue, it's the same coin. It's just two sides. Sorry for anyone that has said that they are Labour. I just feel like it's perpetuating this single coin tossing back and forth situation. So to say they're all the same, well, that's because they only vote for the same people.
Yeah, more people vote for Big Brother and Britain's Got Talent and the European Song Contest.
It's
because
mad.
because they think that they can influence the decision
Yeah.
for the
Yeah.
okay. And here in politics, they think they cannot influence the
Mm.
decision, and which is true, as Professor Grayling said.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean anything. Our votes don't count. So
No, they
therefore, if we concentrate on the on changing the ability to vote, changing the whole system, then maybe there's, well, I know it sounds funny, but maybe then we have some chance that more people are going to vote because they'll feel that their vote counts.
Which is
Can
why,
I-
which is why I spend a lot of my time banging on about the fact that there's what you do in Parliament, there's what you do in the media, but the slow, inefficient, but effective. Can we all unmute? Can we have one?
Can I come in?
I'm going to get in a moment, Jane.
Okay.
But I need to mute a few people. We've got too much back chat going on. So once you've said your piece, could you mute? So you're laughing liberally, Phil, but that's fine. But yeah, so which is why I go on about the one by one change, the stuff, what I call Brexitism. But Jane, come in, please.
I'm now working on a proposal and an article for any potential border poll in Ireland, North and South. And there's 3 points I'm putting to it. Number one, reduce the voting age to 16. Number two, carry out a very, very extensive educational program so that anyone voting in such a referendum will understand how systems operate in Ireland and the UK. And the third one, which I would very much appreciate your thoughts, mandatory voting. Certainly, as a one-off for this referendum, I believe is essential. But why do we not consider that in electoral reform? Bringing in, I'm calling it mandatory. I would love to hear people's thoughts on mandatory voting.
And so I'm going to pass that round. I would say that if you're going to have informed democracy, you have to have election, and you have to have some demand on people to take an interest. It would be better, of course, if they were interested per se. But what do others think about that?
I think that the best way to get people to vote is to teach civics in schools rather than forcing people into mandatory voting. If people understood why they were voting and how the system worked, they might be more inclined to do it off their own back.
Yeah, thank you. And
Peter, just a quick question. Do you have the ability to do a poll on this? Because I'd just be interested to know what people do think, yes or no, on mandatory voting. It's something I've always been torn on myself. Are you able to pop a quick poll up, say people tick A if they're in favour, B if they're against?
Do you know how to do it, Richard?
It should be, if you're host, I think down at the bottom of the screen, you might have a little icon that says polls.
Nope.
Okay, but it may be that it's not on this particular package, but
You could do a rudimentary one using your thumbs up.
I'll look at it. I'll look at it while we're talking. So let me come back to you on that.
And what about the lowering the voting age? I mean, that's a much more acceptable sort of thing to 16. Would that not change the political climate?
Well, undoubtedly it would. But then you've got the next piece of informed,
Don't forget, if it is a legal requirement for you to vote, you don't have to, as long as you turn up to vote, you can still spoil your ballot. So for me, that is the best of both worlds. If you legally are allowed to spoil your ballot, but you have to turn up, otherwise you get fined. I think it's Australia, they fine you if you don't vote. For me, that makes big difference to people, because there are probably plenty of people that did want to vote for Strood North, but something got in the way that day. So yeah, I'm all in favour of it, so I vote yes.
As an Australian,
we'll come to some more questions in a moment. I'm just going to trailblaze a little bit more of the work, and I'll be very brief because it's not our regular meeting. Here is how some of these things look now at the beginnings of them. So this is the beginning of the narrative. So this is one called Breadline Britain, which is really predominantly a socio-economic scenario. and some of it's quite near. So it starts at the end and works backwards. By 2031, the impact of the Brexit Hunger Games being felt through civil unrest, the formation of the People's Progress Party, which is probably this merger that was discussed this evening, and so on. This took place after Jacob Rees-Mogg tried to take over, that's wishful thinking, and so on. The PPP was formed in 2023. It was formed out of people that weren't necessarily politicians, which might be where Rejoin steps in. There was, however, no populist element to it, no particular populist element. And the bit that we discussed with AC Grayling this morning, that the most important thing from Europe to decide whether we're fit to come back in is probably whether we've got rid of the Brexit ultras. And then there's it gets a bit ridiculous here, but it's not finalised yet. Breadline Britain tipped over in September 2021 when children were seen crying in the arms of Dudley Tesco as their parents fought over the last packs of frozen chicken nuggets. An angry woman was here to say, "I voted to get the country back, but not for a chicken shortage," and so on. And Laura and Basildon won a prize on Come Dine Without Me, and so on it goes. I won't go through it all. There's quite a lot of stuff here. Britain was not beaten. Boris Johnson buoyed up by the birth of his second son, Aristotle, who is due on Christmas Eve, I believe. Not that there's any planning involved in birth control here. He's not going to be called Aristotle, clearly. Enough of that. Next point. You have got your hand up, I think, Alex. Do you want to take the floor? And then we'll come back to you, Jane. Alex, you unmuted?
I thought you mentioned someone else first.
Alex, by the way, is the head of Volt UK.
Yeah, hello everybody. Thanks for organizing as well.
Yeah.
It's great to see some familiar faces again. So I would like to kind of really encourage people to join Make Votes Matter. Like if Professor Grayling and I guess a lot of people here talked a lot about like, yeah, we must get PR done, or however you want to call it. I really would love to see all these like pro-European campaigners we have seen on the streets in London and everywhere also joining these Make Votes Matter local groups. I'm personally very often on the streets for Make Votes Matter in Manchester. Happily also like joined by many people from the Manchester for Europe group. Like different and never have enough campaigners on the streets. So please, wherever you are, find out who is a community lead, join these guys.
Can you pop that in the chat box again for us, if you don't mind, Alex?
What exactly? I mean, I cannot share all the local contacts of our people, but I think if you go to the website, you can easily find your local group.
Can you share the website is what I'm saying?
I can share the website, no problem. I'll do that right now.
So Jane, and then I want to see.
Here we go.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, guys. Yeah.
So Jane, and then I want to go to some people who haven't yet spoken. We'll try to get round if we can.
Thank you. Well, I think the simplest of my proposals, and obviously it's for a border poll in Ireland, but if there was a platform of lowering the voting age, that's a pretty non-controversial issue. And if there could be some sort of serious campaigning about lowering the voting age, you get young people really behind us, and the young people are the pro-Europeans. So it's killing a couple of birds with a couple of stones, but lowering the voting age is a simple, easy campaign. Why not?
I'm going to ask you a belligerent, loaded question while we're here, Jane, because I know you're talking about Scotland and Ireland as a bridge to things, and it's not, I don't think it's completely inconsistent with this, but here's the loaded question. Do you think that Europe may encourage Northern Ireland and Ireland to develop lots more trade cooperation and put a wedge between the island of Ireland and what's left of England? Is that the better game to play from the European point of view?
I think the European point of view, they avoid the politics of Northern Ireland like the plague.
Okay.
Absolutely. Now, it's definitely the case now that people are turning round to trade more north-south. But there's an interesting new proposal that there should be a protocol north-south body, but east-west has to come into it, because you can't deal in Northern Ireland on one side only. You've got to do all sides at once. So it has to be north, south, east, west. And I'm absolutely convinced that Europe understands that.
Okay, all right.
Can I just share a little nugget of private information that I happen to know that the head of the Orange Lodge of England was called to Stormont on Sunday afternoon. That's all I know. That's all I know. But the fact that he was called to go over was like, ooh, something's shifting. What do you have thoughts on that, Jane?
Well, very interesting, and obviously, the unionist parties were all backing the dismantling of the protocol, but I think they realise now they can't, and the Ulster Unionists are breaking away and starting to find solutions to the protocol type thing. They realise it's a brick wall, and maybe the Orange Order are going to be pragmatic about this. I don't know, but maybe I think my biggest problem is believing that there's good in people somewhere.
I should point out for those that don't know that Jane worked quite a bit on sort of around the Good Friday Agreement some years ago. So you're a hardened campaigner, and sort of you know what it means to deal with some of the difficulties that surround all the overlapping bits and working parts of this. So
what I do know is that a lot of these people simply they're just not very bright.
No, they all live here, Rachel, in my town. I'm claiming that.
Well,
right.
the interesting thing for me is that it was on a Sunday, Orange Order on a Sunday. Thinking about how those fundamentalists do Sunday, work on Sunday. So there must be something significant going on.
Well, thanks for letting me know. I'll watch out for it.
And Helga's something of an expert on religions, I think, amongst many other things. So that's informed criticism. In other news, I know that I heard that Jacob Rees-Mogg has gone off with Michael Gove, but that's a lie. Right, let's move on to some people that haven't yet said much. So who's keeping quiet at the moment here and really is keen to say something, even if it's of a general nature about the evening?
So, Peter, if you don't mind my 2 cents, just as a layperson.
Would you introduce yourself so everyone knows? It's nice if people get to know people.
Hi, my name's Alison. I can't see my screen right now because my Wi-Fi is very slow, so I can't actually see me. But I'm in Scotland, and the weather is absolutely beautiful. Thus my late arrival this evening. Brexit feels far away, except for the fact that our shellfish industry, salmon industries have been decimated, amongst other things. And in terms of groceries and the rest of it, I think we're suffering as well. But I think we need to be really careful about separating Brexit from rejoining, because there really are some fundamental issues that will need to be addressed. Dare I mention, like, do we join the euro? So I think the pound will be pretty much worthless by then. So yeah, for me, if it's as simple as, just join the euro and then we'll have some economic stability on that front, that would actually be a boon in even 2 or 3 years' time. But there are going to be other issues that will crop up. I think everybody right now thinks, oh, well, we can get back into the single market and we can get our freedom of movement and then we'll be all right, Gov. And I'm like, well, it's not quite that simple. So that's just my 2 bits. But if we do want to look longer term and rejoining the EU, I think that's where we need to start preparing now. Whether or not we've got a 16-year-old vote or we're waiting for the olds to pass on to their next adventure. I just think we need to have a better plan than the Conservatives.
We definitely do, Alison. We'd have a huge agreement about this, but we all pursue the scattergun elements, of which there are many, many elements. Is it PR? Is it making vote matter? Is it fighting the politicians in Parliament? Is it the media, and so on? So we do need an integrated plan, even if we only do bits of it, because it is vast, isn't it?
But I think that the key issues are things that we need to focus on, and people sort of saying, well, we're going to give up the sterling, again, and it's, it's all this, I'm a victim, they've done it to me, they did it before, they're going to do it again, kind of thing. And I just think that's the kind of thing we need to challenge and prepare for, and lay that groundwork.
Thank you.
I think I wanted to say something about the 16-year-olds, because as you know, the White Rose and other organizations are very good at grooming the disaffected youth into their parties, as Farage was done. So
for those that don't know about the White Rose, I keep picking up leaflets from them. They have excellent stickers. They're all over this town, and they come from UKIP people who have gone underground, and they're basically promoting sort of white supremacy and other things. But go on.
No, it was just the thing. If we're going to lower the voting age to 16, I think somebody, I've forgotten, might have been Rachel, mentioned we need to teach proper civics in school so that people understand what their votes mean, because otherwise you will get disaffected youths, creating their bully boy gangs and all for UKIP again, and we'll just have the same thing carrying on, but with a much younger sort of set of bullies getting into power. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
We've got Tushan, and if that's how I say it correctly, and Leah. So you're on.
Hi. So partly following on from what the last speaker said in respect of Scotland, but opening it up to the whole of the UK. Professor Grayling said that an early re-entry to the European Union would be preferable, because the things will change. You'll have to rejoin the euro. You'll have to be part of the Schengen area. You'll have to be. You won't have the rebates that you had last time. You won't have the opt-outs which were there before, and then the EU will move on and make new rules without the UK being there. So there seems to be an underlying assumption that people will vote for that because of the way the country's going now. But I'm not very convinced of it. I'm not sure that...
I have a view which I shall pass round to others. What's your real name, by the way, Tushan?
Oh, Andy.
And where are you from?
I'm from the UK. I'm joining you from Tenerife because...
Oh, okay, right. Well, welcome.
Okay, Brexit vote.
Truly international. I have a view that the elements of what we rejoin on will be just as much out of our control as all the stuff that's going on now. So whether people feel they care about whether they're happy here or not, well, they won't be. That's going to be a detail, and it's a tradable detail as well, insofar as if we were to bend on other elements, I imagine that they'd allow us to do, if we want to keep the pound. There is, in our scenario, it suggests, and Adrian Eakins-Dawkes can speak to this a bit later, it suggests the pound is probably worthless after a few years anyway, so it may not be such an emotional issue. But if others have got views, well, I'm going to go straight to Leah, and then perhaps we can pick that thread up with others. Leah first, then John, and then perhaps Adrian might illuminate us on the pound, actually. Leah.
I personally feel that the last 15, 20 years have shown that a great deal of voting has taken place with people not knowing what they're voting for. And those people have led to everybody else's lives, especially over Brexit. There's been nobody knew what they were voting for. And that not knowing has caused so much damage. And I would really struggle to see that any of that damage would be overturned. I can't see us rejoining the EU within my lifetime, my having a good life kind of lifetime.
I'd like to persuade you that you're wrong.
Pardon?
I'd like to persuade you that you're wrong, but not right now, because we want to get round. But I think we've not talked ourselves into a corner through these scenarios, but there are routes and journeys. The PR one being the one that predominantly Anthony talked about this evening. On a very practical level, you said you were called, what was it on Twitter? Pearl Noir. Is that, I looked it up, you've got no followers. That's not, that's
no,
not,
maybe it's Noir Pearl.
oh, that's, yeah,
Noir Pearl.
helpful clarification. So
Yeah.
if anyone else wants to join up on Twitter, stick your handle in the box as well. But I'll look you up because I looked at Pearl.
That's my second account. I've got a bigger account, but I can't talk politics on that one.
So thank you. John, and then any responses to anything we've had before, please, John.
Hi. First of all, thanks for inviting me onto this, and very interesting talk. So I'm not just as a disclaimer, I'm not a political activist. I'll disclose, a member of the Liberal Democrats, and I did that simply because I felt a few years ago I needed to support, well, again, just to the point earlier around the two parties, I needed to put some, at least show my support for another party, being in complete despair over the last 5 years, as it sounds everyone else here. Just the thing on, for me, I mean, one of the things that was interesting that Anthony actually fell victim to in his talk, you only mentioned it once, was, again, you hear this a lot, of the arguments about the positives of the EU, again, saying it's not perfect, but, and I, having just had that discussion around the euro as well, if you look at things like the euro, you look at, you know, some of the, it's always been framed, the debate in this country, as a way of all these exceptions that the UK managed to pick up over the years as a good thing. You know, isn't it great that we didn't join the euro, etc. Actually, I'm not an economist, but looking at things, it'd be interesting to know, had Gordon Brown said yes to the euro 20 years ago, would we be richer now? And I've got a feeling we would be. And yet the debate is not being framed at all in that way. So one of the things I found frustrating is the fact that, is this sort of don't mention Brexit? Because in a way, although I recognise there's the Ramona label and all of that, and, it gets framed in that way, and people like Keir Starmer are desperate to get away from that. But I think, it suits Boris Johnson to say Brexit was done, let's not talk about it again. It's vanished because as all of the problems start to circulate, when people don't talk about things, people don't associate things with that. And I really think that all of these issues, that's why the media are talking about supply chain issues and all of these sorts of things. And if you notice, actually, Boris Johnson, even today and yesterday in some of his speeches around the social care tax, COVID is starting to be talked now in a way that is a historic event. We've got the vaccine, successful vaccine rollout and all the rest of it. It's behind us. And again, COVID is being used as a nice cover for Brexit, but that itself is now being positioned as again, as a historic event. And it just sort of drowns out any debate about these things. So COVID being a cover for Brexit, and all of those things going away, and he uses that again and again to his advantage, and almost playing along by not mentioning the B word. Yeah, well, as I've often said on the street, it's a one-way street if we ever have Brexit out of the lexicon. So that's why it's got to be kept on a sort of low boil, I think, and everyone is running scared from it in Parliament, particularly. The result, the thing on the street isn't the same, actually. If you talk about Brexit in pubs, cafes, people will talk to you about it, even here, which is very, very Brexit. Whereabouts are you, by the way, John? I'm in Buckinghamshire, little village called, or big village called Haddenham, near, in between Aylesbury and Oxford, near Tame. Very well. Yeah. So until recently, I was the Speaker's constituency, so even less of a say in anything than most people. I used to do some work up at Jansen Sea Lag there, so I know the area quite well. Anyway, let's just move on. It's not a social chat, although it is. Jane, you've had your hand up for ages, and then Richard, please.
It was on the question of the euro. we've sort of got a dual currency status. You can use euros in shopping trolleys and telephone boxes and things like that. I haven't. In the early days, I tried using it in shops, and you would get your change in pounds. So it's quite an interesting one. A dual currency, best of both worlds. Why not?
Well, that was what I was putting to you earlier, that perhaps the European strategy with Ireland is to encourage the best of both worlds and gradually diverge them from Britain, what remains of Britain. But anyway,
I definitely think that they haven't got that sort of Machiavellian. They're not interested in the politics of it, just the commerce, really. I believe it.
All right, then. So on the ground, if Ireland and Northern Ireland find they have more trade to do, will that naturally produce a bridge? I don't mean a bridge or a tunnel from Britain to from Scotland to Ireland, but a bridge across the troubled waters, so to speak.
Well, in Ireland, definitely more trade, intertrade on this island will help, and also more production in Northern Ireland. Yes.
You do know, of course, that we believe that we're the only people that make sausages.
You haven't heard of Cookstown, the best family?
We have. Well, actually, I have. I'm the only person that's heard of them here, because you must have our sausages. Apparently, you can't make them yourself.
I know, totally crazy. That's back to the media. It's crazy that wise voices are not being given airtime at all.
Richard, onwards. Thank you.
Sorry, just unmuting myself. Thank you, Peter. So some very interesting contributions. I just wanted to follow up on there, particularly the points that Leah and John were making there. One thing that I did feel slightly uncomfortable with in the introductory speech was Mr. Grayling's assumption that we will definitely rejoin the EU. Now, I would love to say that. Leah goes the other way and says, I don't think we're going to rejoin the EU in our lifetime. And I think there is a very dark potential path ahead of us. And I think we should all take on board that there are big problems if we fail. There is a very, very nasty group of people that are taking over the country, the media. As John quite rightly said, things that should be being brought to our attention are being brushed off as history. We're being encouraged to move on and forget about every dark deed that's been done by, I would say, this quite evil government that we've got at the moment. The other point I would just say is, whilst I do also take on board what everyone said about electoral reform and how electoral reform would be a very useful thing, I think there's 2 points I'd make on that. Number one, it's not going to win an election, that platform. You are not going to be able to persuade the majority of this country to be other things that are going along with it. Personally, of course, I think closer relations with the EU, rejoining the EU is an important one. I think many, many more people will probably be focused on the tax and the pound in their pocket as a result of what's going on in the government at the moment. I don't think we can win on PR alone. And secondly, I think PR is almost just as dangerous as Brexit, in that it means so many different things to so many different people. Now, if you were to ask me, am I in favor of PR? Absolutely, I am. If you were to ask me what method of PR I'd be into, I think it would probably be a very different one to perhaps everyone else's vision of PR in this particular room. So I would just caution that the whole debate about PR, we have to be sure what we're actually talking about when we are talking about reforming the electoral system. Otherwise, it will be just as divisive a discussion that we have as Brexit. Those were just the points I wanted to make following up on that. And one final point, Peter, thank you so much for organising this tonight. It's been such a brilliant event, and thank you for making it possible.
Can you still see the scenarios for Brexit up here, Richard?
Yes, I can.
Well, there's a little bit I skated over, because this fictional PPP, the People's Progress Party, which probably doesn't have a real life, it's just an Aunt Sally. One of the things it does say there somewhere, it says that they campaign on a platform of a better Britain in a better Europe through better politics. So constitutional reform was part of it, but it wasn't the whole of it, and certainly wasn't the most pressing part of it. So it was obviously, I'd sort of downgraded it in the thinking in that sort of little package there, just to say that. So so I'm going to stop going back to that now. Adrian, do you want to talk us through a little bit about economics and the pound particularly, because Adrian used to work at the European Commission. He had a distinguished career there. He comes on our meetings every Monday, and he knows a lot about sort of the whole business of how politics interlinks with economics and social things. If you're there, Adrian, that is. You may have to unmute yourself. Can we see you first of all? Perhaps he's gone for a glass of wine. Adrian? We can't see him, so I'm going to pass on. Someone else, please. We're running a bit out of time, but and I want to reserve a little bit of time for people to know each other. Brendan, you never managed to get on. I don't know why. I've tried to unmute you several times. So if you're itching to speak, then you should. We've got other people on the call as well. So anyone that hasn't spoken really is my sort of call at this time of night. Just go in, just do it. Mike, you haven't been on for much this evening.
Me?
Yeah, but I mean, so yeah. Is anything you want to reflect?
Well, there's a reflection I could share, which is I was thinking of earlier. Many hundreds of years ago, I had a job where, in order to succeed in my job, I had to persuade people in a whole organization that a decision, well, to take a different decision from one that they'd made several years earlier. What I rapidly discovered was what didn't work was to say, you know, that decision you made 3 years ago, 5 years ago, that was a crazy decision. You were all idiots. What did work in some cases, and this is measurably sales targets and things, what did work was to say, decision was taken a few years ago with, you know, there were various circumstances at the time, and it may be understandable why that was taken. Let's look at the situation that we're in now. Let's look at the circumstances that apply now and see what the way forward, what the best way forward is with a kind of, you know, a clear slate, an objective view and an open mind. And I just commend that to us because, you know, we probably all do it at times in some ways, kind of replay 2016. But I would just commend and it's an, you know, it's an encouragement to myself as much to anybody else to say, where are we and what do we have to do to go forward? You know, which Anthony's talk is completely in line with. But
this is a book on mental erasure, how to wipe people's minds clean on Brexit, apart from anything else. So that's the manual on how to do it. Although I wasn't here to sell you that, of course. I often get picked up for promotion, but yet we do need to find ways of producing a clean slate, or at least rubbing out assumptions, beliefs, and in some cases identity. I've spent thousands of hours on the street in cafes and bars talking to people, and after an hour and a half of talking to them, what they've got left, once we've cleared racism, you know, bananas and all the other things, there's something deeply seated in some of them about their identity. It's wrapped up with the, you know, the flag of the Queen and the flag. Yeah, I was talking to somebody the other day. At a mundane level, it's often down to the fact they don't like garlic or they want to fish.
There's comments on my YouTube channel yesterday from somebody who voted to leave the EU because he couldn't park in his street.
Yeah, that sort of stuff. So there's a high level, identity level thing. It's tied to something that we think is quite ridiculous. They don't think it's quite ridiculous. That's the point. And letting them let go. And the book is really a therapeutic book disguised as a practical book, but spending long enough for them to realize that that's ridiculous is one of the modus operandi, and doing what counsellors do very well, of, you know, sort of unconditional positive regard, even if they are talking absolute shite.
Yeah.
So I have, it will surprise some of you because I'm known to be quite a fierce character, but I also have this ability to listen to people talking tripe for years.
Yeah.
And that's the quality that we have to actually endure. And I do tell people that a Brexism needs skill, patience and time, but patience is perhaps key. Listening to talk shite. Anyway, someone else before we wrap up here. Adrian, are you back on now? He's come and go. No, he isn't. Oh, yes, he is. Yes, he is. I think we've got him. Adrian.
Shameless promotion, Reboot Britain mugs.
Oh, there we go. Excellent. Excellent value. How do we get them, Helga?
I'll put them, they're £10 each, including postage, and I'll put the link in the chat. You can do it by PayPal.
Helga is our records and mugs and merchandising person. Oh, I think we get £1 out of it, don't we, or something like that, or 50p.
Something like that.
Okay. Anyway, that's not really the top of my mind, because I'm beginning to feel that perhaps, you know, I'm going to curtail some of my activities. But these are very good mugs anyway, and they go all over the world, as was demonstrated by our German people. So any final thoughts? And then I'm going to sort of make some suggestions about what we might do next, because you've been lovely, as they say, when you talk to audiences. You've been the best audience I've had this evening. So what else have we got? We've got loads of new people here. I'd like to hear from 1 or 2 of them before we wrap up. Rod, you're on from Switzerland / Italy. Are you there? And we've got Oliver Scaramucci, who I've never spoken to in my life. And we've got Lynn Nikkanen, Kay Richards. Don't know any of these people, so it'd be nice just for you to say hi and introduce Ian Charlton, who came on today. Don't know any of these people. Karen McFettridge. If you're there, just drop in and say, hello, I'm so-and-so, I live there and I do this. So a bit of networking at the final end. Don't be shy.
Perhaps I could just mention as the token Aussie here that compulsory voting doesn't make a huge difference. It does. If you're going to make voting compulsory, then you do have to make votes count. So first past the post isn't definitely going to cut it. But and it does increase awareness. But I think if people are turning up and just spoiling the ballot papers, and a fair bit of that used to go on. It's kind of.
So responding to that, Phil, I mean, we have the tools now to do red button voting about anything, our street, our town, our country. We have the tools to do it, but without in a period where people understand what it is they're voting about, that could be the populist's dream, couldn't it?
Mm.
You'd be, you know, I would go right off democracy if you've just got the noisiest person in the street voting to, you know, install parking meters or something. It's the sort of a neighborhood watch gone mad. So without an educational stream underneath democracy, particularly at the higher level, I guess that, yeah. What do you think? I don't know what I'm saying there. So say something more to fill the gap. Do you think education matters, in other words?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay, right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are taught stuff. But I mean, when I was in Australia, I never actually got to vote for, the person I voted for never actually got into government. Except for Gough Whitlam, who was promptly sacked by the Governor General. So it doesn't necessarily give you more voice, if you see what I mean. Also, I was going to ask, Professor Grayling didn't mention this sort of stepwise re-entry scheme at all, and it seems to me quite probable that there will be pressure to rejoin the customs union from everyone, really, from industry and everyone. And I could see that happening independent of any political developments or referenda or anything.
And I'm going to bring Ian in, and who's unmuted in a moment. But just to respond to that, if anyone else has got a view, I worry about the logical incremental road, because if you deal with a sector, then they walk away and say, that's good. And then your pool of people who have the interest in solving the wider problem gets smaller and smaller and smaller.
Yep, exactly.
So it may never, ever solve the problem of passports and 67 million people. Although I also understand that by stepwise incrementalism, it will eventually go, well, why don't we go back where we were? But the pressure to do it may not be there unless that's managed properly. So it's a huge problem that we're not going to bang to rights in 5 minutes from here tonight. But I do worry about solving sectoral problems.
Yeah.
It pays to self-interest, so you can see why it works, but it diminishes your overall ability to solve other problems. Ian, have you got an answer for this, please? I like James O'Brien now. What's the answer, Ian?
Oh, I wish I did have an answer for you, and I've been much wealthier than I have been. But what I wanted to point out, that I think there's enough on the demographics and the educational basis of people who voted Remain and people who voted out to give us all an idea that perhaps there's something wrong. There's not enough people educated well enough to understand the issues to vote on, and this was touched on earlier in the conversation.
Where are you calling in from tonight, by the way?
From Wakefield, from home in
God's own country.
Well, they call it so, and I'm a Yorkshireman.
And my favourite guitarist, Bill Nelson, came from Wakefield. But there we go.
Oh yes, of course. Well, I originate from near Middlesbrough, where we had David Coverdale, of course.
Oh, okay, right, fantastic. All right, no.
But the educational basis has certainly got to be looked at.
Mm-hmm.
More work.
Okay. I think everyone is starting to feel. I see people drifting off the call, and I think therefore I need another cup of tea. If there's any one final thing that anyone wants to say, otherwise I'm going to wrap up for tonight and just point the way forward. There isn't, so I'm going to wrap up and point the way forward. So thank you very much for coming. We had a really good time, I hope. And it somewhat pleasantly from me, much of what AC Grayling had to say was not miles away from what we're working on, but we'll feed it into that. So the next step is to feed that in. I would urge you to, if you enjoyed this hour, we have a slightly more structured sessions on a Monday, but they're not over structured. And the thing that's different from them than the usual Zoom meetings is with about 10, 20 or sometimes 30 people, everyone has a go if they want to have a go. They're the most fun you can have on Zoom. That's my promise. My style isn't for everyone, but I run it fairly sort of tight for time, and we try to get as many people in with a contribution. And we do certain actions like writing letters. We do certain things like longer range things. At the moment, we're on this longer range thing, and along came AC Grayling's thing, and it meshed together quite nicely. So thank you all for the evening. Enjoy the rest of the evening, and bollocks to Brexit.
Thanks very much, Peter.
Hear, hear.
And do network. The most important thing is I will send this chat to you. I will make the video available. Anthony did ask that because he's doing a tour, prefers you not to share it with people until after he's finished that tour. He's like a rock star, obviously. He's going to do the same set every time. No, he's not exactly, but you know, people, they won't book to come on if they've seen the video. So would you kindly respect that? I'll put it up as an unlisted YouTube video, but just keep it a little bit quiet until such time as it's okay to let it go. And please make sure that you share your details with people that you want to share them to. I, with your permission, will mail out to people that have put into here and connect them up and what have you. So you can use me as a sort of social secretary if there are people you want to connect with. Good night, all.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night, Peter. Good night, all. Bye.
Bye.
Nighty night.